I just wanted to say welcome to everybody. And to kick off the evening, I'd like to welcome the wonderful Jess Ribeiro.
We went walking through the flowers over by the old school paddock. Mom and Dad were sleeping soundly. Brother Ben was snoring loud as I snuck out of my window to meet you at the crossing. We held hands and talked for hours underneath a bending pine tree. Laughed a lot, we shared a joint and a flagon of port from L.W. Burgess Hardware Store. Oh, soon, man, you've got me crazy. I'm cartwheeling over you, rolling down the hill. Write me letters, don't forget me when you go. We sometimes see your face in the papers. I cut them out and pin them on the wall. I wish that I'd have kissed you that morning, but you know that I'm not that kind of bird. It's been a while since I went walking over by the old school paddock. My father doesn't live here now. My brother's grown up and got a girlfriend. Well, I finally got a key to Mama's house, but I'm still sneaking out my window, wondering where do you go?
Thanks.
This was Jess Ribeiro. Portuguese. And she'll come back again.
At the end.
Yes. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Okay.
Good evening. My name is Leanne Miller. I am Julian Yagan Yalupna of the Yorta Yorta Nation. I'm also a board member of the Victorian Women's Trust. Tonight, I'd like to acknowledge my great-grandfather's country, the land of the Wurundjeri. I'd also like to acknowledge the Victorian Women's Trust Board and our association for the past 20-odd years. But when I think of my grandfather's country, I think about the number of times people have heard Wominjaka, and note that it is welcome, but it's also about challenging you, asking you about what is your intention. We know tonight the intention of this event is for you to feel comfortable, give and listen to some amazing women on the panel. I have the privilege of working alongside Duré Dara, who's to the right to me, and I'd like to introduce Duré.
Thank you. Good evening. I stand next to Leanne because the Women's Trust for 28 years has had an equal relationship with Koorie Women Mean Business, of which Leanne has been the executive director for 16 years. The board, the convener, our executive director, Leanne and I, we all work together. We will never walk in the work that we do for women and girls without walking with Aboriginal women in this state, if nothing else. From time to time, Leanne says, Duré, that won't do, it's not good enough. From time to time, she'll say, Mary, I don't think we should do that. From time to time, I have to keep asking questions. Can I do this? Should I do that? What is going on? What is it you want? And my message to you is, find someone you can ask questions, do the work, be rigorous. All the people in the monthly and the sessions and all the journalists in this world work for someone. Talk to someone who's experiencing it. Talk to someone who has a real wish. 200 years of occupation and you think you can tell them what to do with 6 millennia of looking after this country? We have a Prime Minister who doesn't believe in climate change while the earth is suffering, and we're supposed to sit around like dummies? Do the work. The relationship for reconciliation is not about sitting and talking to each other about each other. It's about working together outside of ourselves so we learn the taste and the smell of our relationship and who we are separately and together. And we've got to do the work. I have all the time. I make mistakes all the time when it comes to issues of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Read it, ask the questions, let's resolve to do it. Tarana has come to remind us that women of colour have to work very hard. 4% of the money in America goes to coloured women. 4%. And there are new organisations from the film industry who are getting a lot of money. She's not getting a lot of money. She's worked every day for 7 days. And I just say to you, without being in any way, not including myself, we have to do the work. What are you doing in your pillow talk? What are you doing in your bathrooms? What are you doing in your living rooms? Start the conversation with your children. Love them enough to let them have an understanding so they know, and they know what questions to ask. Enough said. Koorie Women Business keeps us enlivened, engaged, and to a certain truth-telling. And that's what Aboriginal people are saying. We want the truth-telling, the truth. So let's forget about all the rhetoric and go for the truth. So thank you for coming and enjoy Tarana.
Thank you, Leanne Miller and Duré Dara. Your sentiments and friendship unambiguously sets the tone for tonight's event. Their grace, the deep respect they have for one another, their commitment to a shared cause and to action, and the importance of true partnership. The integrity of word and deed is also no better illustrated tonight by the life of Beatrice Faust, who passed on the 30th of October this year. Beatrice founded the Women's Electoral Lobby in 1972. She co-founded the Civil Liberties group in 1996. She was a passionate campaigner for abortion law reform. Beatrice Faust exemplified word and deed. And I know there are about 8 women who had the privilege of working alongside Beatrice during their time at the Women's Electoral Lobby, and they are here tonight, and I think it just is a timely reinforcement that we're nothing in the feminist movement unless we're taking action and going deeper than talk. And I do want to say a brief thank you to the City of Yarra for making a venue such as this affordable and accessible to organisations such as ours and to many other organisations in the community. We really owe them a thanks. But I'd like to start proceedings now by calling on Susan Briggs to say a few words of welcome to you as well. Susan is the Executive Director of the Sydney Peace Prize. She has a wide-ranging background in the not-for-profit sector, in the public and private sectors, and it has been an absolute pleasure to work with Susan in helping bring this special public event to Melbourne tonight. So if Susan would like to...
Thanks, Mary. Thank you to our wonderful partner, the Victorian Women's Trust, and especially to Mary Crooks, in particular, for being so enthusiastic about the International Peace Prize this year. Everything we do at the Sydney Peace Foundation is in partnership. It's in our DNA. So we're only very tiny. There's only 2 of us in the office. We need to work in partnership and collaboration. So we thank you for your friendship, the Victorian Women's Trust, which has enabled us to come down here to Melbourne with Tarana Burke and Tracey Spicer. The Sydney Peace Foundation exists because extraordinary people around the world have powerful solutions for the world's biggest problems. And our job is to highlight these solutions, to do our bit to create a peaceful, fair, just, compassionate world that cares for all its people and our only planet. We've been going for 22 years and we've highlighted the work of 22 inspiring people or movements from all corners of the globe. As you know, this year it's the Me Too movement. And that is for empowering survivors of sexual harassment and violence and elevating their voices, for truth and justice, for highlighting the breadth and impact of sexual violence worldwide, and for launching a demand for change that's sweeping the world. We know that to achieve peace with justice, we need to confront the issue of sexual violence and sexual harassment in all its forms, in all situations. Tarana Burke, the founder and leader of the global Me Too movement, and Tracey Spicer, the catalyst for the hashtag MeToo coming to Australia, have accepted the prize on behalf of the movement, a movement with way too many wonderful heroes to count. Both women have said they are accepting the prize for survivors of violence, and in Tarana Burke's words, we dedicate the prize to the survivor who hasn't yet found the words to tell their story. If this prize encourages and contributes to the public conversation about harassment and assault, and if it reminds us that we cannot live in peace together if some of us are bullying, harassing, intimidating and assaulting the others, then it's done its job. Thank you for being here tonight and for standing with the Sydney Peace Foundation for the survivors of sexual assault and violence.
We've just changed the format a little bit tonight. Tarana has had such a gruelling many days, and we're going to focus on her almost entirely leading a panel, and we've extended the time for that panel a little bit more. We won't be taking questions from the audience tonight because the process we adopted was for people to file us their questions when they booked their tickets. And so I've been through those and I've picked out questions that I think go to the central themes we want to explore on the panel. Can I say that there is information around tonight about referral services and that we have organised, if there is an opportunity or if there's a need for anybody who finds aspects of this discussion triggering or disconcerting to talk to and would like to talk to someone after the event, we've made provision for space and for professional support to do that. That would be a matter of connecting with Maria Chikuti, our event organiser. Let me introduce Tarana as the lead panellist in the following way. As a youth worker dealing predominantly with children of colour, Tarana Burke had seen and heard her share of heartbreaking stories. During a bonding session at a youth camp in 1997, one of the girls asked to speak to Tarana privately. Tarana describes it in this way. This girl had a deep sadness and a yearning for confession that I read immediately and wanted no part of it. For the next several minutes, this child, Heaven, as she was called, struggled to tell me about her stepdaddy, or rather her mother's boyfriend, who was doing all sorts of monstrous things to her 13-year-old body. I was horrified by her words. The emotions welling inside of me ran the gamut, and I listened until I could literally not take it anymore, which turned out to be less than 5 minutes. Then, right in the middle of her sharing her pain with me, I cut her off and immediately directed her to another female counsellor who could help her better. I'll never forget the look on her face. I will never forget the look because I think about her all the time. The shock of being rejected, the pain of opening a wound only to have it abruptly forced closed again. It was all on her face. Tarana went on to say, as much as I love children, as much as I cared about that child, I could not find the courage that she had found. I could not muster the energy to tell her that I understood, that I connected, that I could feel her pain. I couldn't help her release her shame or impress upon her that nothing that happened to her was her fault. I could not find the strength to say out loud the words that were ringing in my head over and over again as she tried to tell me what she had endured. I watched her walk away from me as she tried to recapture her secrets and tuck them back into their hiding place. I watched her put her mask back on and go back into the world like she was all alone, and I couldn't even bring myself to whisper, "Me too." This really bothered Tarana. She said it sat in her spirit for a long time. 10 years later, in 2006, Tarana Burke created Just Be Inc., a non-profit organisation to help victims of sexual violence. She sought out the resources that she had not found readily available to her 10 years before, and she committed herself to being there for people who'd been abused. And she gave her movement a name, Me Too. Please welcome as our lead panellist, breaker of the oppressive silence on sexual violence, civil rights activist, seasoned campaigner, warrior for justice and for a better world, Tarana Burke. I think you're second. I think Tarana's feeling about her health and self-care has just gone up a notch. Thank you. Could I also welcome to the stage Dr. Kyllie Cripps, Senior Lecturer in Law at the University of New South Wales. We have seen Kyllie many times at Victorian Women's Trust. She's a proud Pallawah woman. She has spent over 20 years doing intensive, far-reaching research on violence, family violence, sexual assault and child abuse within Australia's Indigenous communities. Could I also welcome Kate Jenkins? Kate, I'm sure you know, has been Sex Discrimination Commissioner since 2016. She has been leading the National Inquiry into Sexual Harassment in Australian workplaces, as well as collaborating on projects such as cultural reform in the Australian Defence Force. Welcome, Kate. And finally, could I ask you to welcome warmly Tracey Spicer, Walkley Award winner as an author, journalist and broadcaster, co-founder of Women in Media and Now Australia, and along with Tarana, a recently minted Sydney Peace Prize recipient. Okay, so I'm going to take my place over there, but I'll explain. We'll be going in the panel for something up to an hour. We're going to try really hard to keep a focus on what we see are the central issues, offer a chance for all the panellists to reflect on their experience and their wisdom. I haven't given the four panellists any warning of the ground that we're going to cover, the issues that we're going to raise, because I wanted you to hear and see them, thinking hard on the spot in response to the discussion. And I have selected questions from the ones that were filed into us. They'll be threaded through the discussion. Thank you. Okay. First of all, we're going to talk magnitude. The magnitude of the problem. The ubiquity of sexual violence simply cannot be denied. The essence of the Me Too movement, in fact, is that it has enabled millions, hundreds of thousands of women in particular, to start to give expression to a pain that they've carried for a long time. Kyllie, through your work, give us a little bit about the magnitude of the problem of sexual violence.
I've been working in this field for a long time, and when you go out into the community, you know, it's one thing to read statistics, and statistics can be quite blunt, and I think it's more important to actually sit with the women and the girls and to hear their stories. And I think early on in my research, sitting with a particular community, and they were saying that, you know, not one girl by the age of 18 hadn't experienced sexual abuse. That is the experience for our Indigenous women and girls. It's not to say it's like that in every community, but for some communities that's exactly what it's like. And it's about how do we respond to that? How do we make sure that those women and those girls are appropriately supported?
Yeah. Tarana, over to you. The magnitude of the problem as you see it.
You know, when people ask me often about if I was surprised that Me Too, the hashtag, took off the way it did, my answer is always no, because I'd seen in smaller instances just how big the problem is. I've never been in a room where I've done a workshop or training or talk about sexual violence where more than half the room couldn't say Me Too. And that had been my experience since we started doing this work. I often say, we were talking about this backstage, if you're not a survivor, you know one. It is deeply pervasive, and because so many people only take parts of the spectrum of sexual violence, they don't see the whole picture. But if we're going to truly talk about the magnitude of sexual violence, we have to talk about violent language, violent interactions, institutional violence, state-sanctioned violence, familial violence. All of this creates a spectrum of sexual violence, and we have to look at the entire thing. Even the numbers that came out as a result of Me Too going viral lets you know, when you have 12 million people respond to a singular hashtag in 24 hours, that's just a drop in the bucket of the magnitude, because for every person that put hashtag Me Too on the internet, there's probably 5 more who couldn't do it. So it's deeply pervasive, which is why we categorize it and talk about it as a public health crisis.
I'll come back to that later. Tracey Spicer, the magnitude from your experience.
If it's okay, I'd like to talk about the magnitude, not only in numbers, but also the deep damage that's done in each and every instance. When I sent out my tweet in October 2017, I was quite naive. I expected to get about 10 to 15 responses. To this day, I've received more than 2,000 from people across all industries. And one email to me exemplifies how deep and long-term the damage is, and I think this is something we haven't talked about enough as a society. A 73-year-old woman contacted me. She said, I was sexually harassed, it was actually indecent assault, on my first job as a secretary at the age of 17. She said, I quit that job immediately. I never worked again. I never trusted authority again. I never told my husband, and he died last year. I said to her what I've said to everyone, I want to be led by you. Do you want counselling help, legal support? Would you like to tell your story in a supported way in the media? She said, I want none of those things. I just wanted to tell someone and be believed before I died. And she carried that with her for more than half a century. So I think we need to talk about the deep damage as part of the magnitude.
Thank you. And Kate Jenkins, you must know of the magnitude through the prism of the National Inquiry, if you didn't beforehand.
Absolutely, and in the work I do, violence against women is one of the top 3 priorities. One of the things about Australia, so we talk about the statistics and the stories, and we know the stories really, Rosie Batty's story really ignited a passion and a motivation to change. But actually in Australia, I think that the statistics are really important as well, because there is this kind of general narrative, I think it goes to the harm and the prevalence, is Me Too. When it happened in Australia in that 2017, I always said this is different than ever before, but a hashtag doesn't solve the problem. Right. And so we need to work on how we solve it, which is the National Inquiry. But what the hashtag did is it did tell everyday people about the prevalence, huge prevalence, and the harm, the ongoing harm. And then it also talked about the silence. So if we go just to the prevalence, because sexual harassment's been unlawful in this country, so if I just stay at that part of sexual violence, since 1984. And the Human Rights Commission's been doing surveys about every 4 years since 2003. And our last survey last year, which was after Me Too had hit, told us that 1 in 3 Australian workers have experienced sexual harassment. 39% of women, 26% of men, particularly much higher rates in LGBTI and people with disabilities, a whole lot of communities. And particularly bad for young people, that 15, 18 to 29 years of age. Now, actually the narrative in Australia, if you talk to the average corporate person, is it's not happening that much, we don't have complaints, and it's not really that harmful. So the main reason people don't complain is, well, it's not serious enough. So this idea that actually there's bad stuff and then there's just the everyday sexual harassment. So I'm really keen that we do tell those numbers a lot and we tell the stories as well.
So am I right in what I've read about that the numbers of incidents are increasing and the rate of reporting is decreasing?
Yes. Well, the rate of reporting is at 17%. That's been pretty flat and low forever. But yeah, 1 in 3. So the last time we did the survey in 2012, it was 1 in 5. And that's not a reflection of Me Too and everyone now thinks they're being harassed. The way the survey's done is it asks about the actual behaviours. Yeah. So that goes against the narrative, particularly in the business world, of surely it doesn't happen anymore, surely it's getting better. So actually these facts need to be repeated every day because people want to believe it's not happening.
I want to come back, Tarana, to your point about a public health crisis. So if we could round off the discussion of magnitude by reference to what you think defines that in terms of incidence, harm, injury, long-term effects.
Absolutely. I think that there's not enough information, public information, or even discourse about the long-term effects of sexual violence. To your point, Tracey, there's economic effects, there's psychological effects, there's this generational, what we call the generational curse. There are all kinds of ways. In the U.S., there's a statistic that says if a woman of color experiences sexual violence by the time they're 18, and we know that there's almost 70% chance that that's going to happen, then she is 66% more likely to experience it again as an adult. So that means you have many, many women, particularly women of color, who have multiple instances of sexual violence that they're dealing with. So you take that and sit that alone, or sit that statistic off by itself, and then examine what that does, right? We need more information about how sexual violence affects our lives, the unraveling that happens. And then we would understand that if you have millions of people whose lives have been affected by this singular thing, and each person that is affected takes a toll in their life in different ways, that is indeed a crisis. And I compared it to, and I often compare it to a disease, because if there was any disease, infectious disease that we could see, if you woke up tomorrow and everybody in here had a rash, mysteriously, right? People would respond to that. And they would say, if 12 million people woke up tomorrow and said, oh my gosh, I have this thing too. Oh my gosh, look at this rash that we all have now. The world would stop. And we would be having a different conversation in this moment. And the fact that 19 million people in 1 year used the hashtag, right? There are millions and millions of people who have now come forward to say their life has been affected by sexual violence. And if it was anything else, we would agree that this is unconscionable. But we don't look at sexual violence in the same way because it's individualized. And so it becomes this person, you need some services, you need to heal, you need to deal with your issue, but this is not a social justice issue or a public health issue, because also people don't feel, we need people to feel responsible, just as responsible as we do. We need people to feel like it's a community crisis. If somebody dies violently in our community, we feel a need to rally around that and make our communities more safe. If somebody experiences sexual violence in our community, we need a similar response. We need people to say, not another child will die at the hand of gun violence, not another child will be molested in our community, not another person will experience sexual violence without our voices being lent to ending that.
So we know that in the instance of breaking the silence, silence that's not golden, it's oppressive. We know from all of our stories about girls and women recoiling and freezing in the moment and feeling burdened by what is a secret and feelings of shame and awkwardness. How far, as a panel, do you think we have come to date in tracing and understanding the complex web of attitudes that underpin unequal power relations that is the root cause of sexual violence? How far have we come?
In that, do you mean does the general public understand that it's power?
Our understanding, general public understanding, because working on the basis that your solutions will be as good as your analysis of the problem.
I would say, I think that one of the things that needs to happen is that the narrative around sexual violence, as we understand it, as the general public understand it, has to shift. And I think one of the disservices that the hashtag going viral has created is this focus on the individual and not the systems, and not talking about power, and not talking about privilege, and not talking about access and unequal access and those kind of things, or as I call it, the unchecked accumulation of power and what that does. And so I don't know that we've come really far in people understanding those dynamics, because it's still very individualized. And so we think about individual bad actors, right? The boogeyman who jumps out the bushes, or the Harvey Weinstein, who is just if we could just get rid of that guy, things would be okay. When again, like I keep saying, there is another Harvey Weinstein right now. There are several of them right now that are in place with just as much power. Just to use pop culture for a second, when Harvey Weinstein's story broke and people were like, oh, it's appalling, it's just incredible, I can't believe it, and one of the people in that crowd in the chorus of voices was Les Moonves, who was the CEO of CBS, who a year later had the exact same accusations levied against him with the same amount of people coming forward. So these getting rid of individuals does not undo a system. And so I do think that we rely very heavily on these singular stories and these salacious headlines, and think, if we just pluck out the weeds, that we'll be okay, and that's not true.
So quickly on that, Tracey.
This is why the media has to start covering more stories of particularly women in low-paid industries and marginalised communities, because that's where the power imbalance is the greatest. When we were filming the documentary earlier this year, we went to a fruit packing shed outside of Shepparton here in Victoria and met a woman who we call Mariam. Now, her identity was disguised because the power imbalance is so great in her circumstance. She was indecently assaulted by the boss in this fruit packing shed. She was on an insecure visa. Her and her husband had just come over from Malaysia. He worked in the fruit packing shed as well. And I cannot think of a story. I know that there are stories that are equally with such a huge power imbalance, but this just broke my heart. Here she is, isolated on this farm. She was hired by a cash contractor, so the farmer had no legal liability, and this is what's happening with labour hire firms. So that speaks to what Tarana's talking about structural imbalance. The union came in, spoke up on her behalf. Unfortunately, both Mariam and her husband lost their jobs for speaking out. And these are the stories that the media needs to tell, because if we don't tell these stories, nothing will change for the most marginalised people in this country.
Okay, and Kate, how far have we come in really understanding the underpinnings? I mean, the issue has been around for centuries.
Yes.
It's no accident that one of the main reasons why women in this country wanted the vote was to do something about the violence in the homes and on the streets.
Yeah. I think, as we've done the national inquiry and we're launching in February, the primary thing, spoiler alert, is that gender inequality is underpinning the sexual harassment and also sexual violence. So this, as a country, we have been a leader in coming up with that conclusion. Vic Health in 2007 was sort of the first one which said, we've done the research, it's not alcohol, it's not mental health, it's not, all of those things contribute, but underneath there is gender inequality and the power imbalance. That is underpinning this. So in this country, we've started working on that issue. However, I still think that, and you will know, and we read in the papers as well, this idea of gender inequality is something that is absolutely, it's almost viewed as we can't talk about it. What about the men? We spend a lot of time talking about the men. And the reality is gender inequality, so sexual harassment happens to men and women, but it doesn't mean that gender inequality isn't the circumstances. Going to I guess, Tarana's point, the other thing that I'm really obsessed by is, as an employment lawyer for all those years, for 20 years, I did all these cases, and then I did some work with Victoria Police, which I think you know, and we spent a year looking at sexual harassment, sexual assault and predatory behaviour. And it was strictly confidential. We heard all these stories, awful stories, some of rape, but also some of 20 years of just belittling and in that briefing of the top 20 before it all came out, they said, look, I know it's all confidential, Kate, but you know who the problems are. Could you just tell us who they are? Just like write it on a bit of paper and we'll never say that we had the names. And that was the moment. Like 40% of the workforce had been harassed or preyed on in the previous 5 years. And I said, if you think there is a few names I can give you, so this goes to Tarana's, then you are misunderstanding the nature of the cultural and the systemic problem that you face. So to some degree, even though I think the media has been really critical for us to get to a point to do some work, I actually, from my corporate life, know that those corporates fear most media. So when we look at all the settlements, of which I always advise to get, when we look at the confidentiality, when we look at the pretending there's no problem here, it's actually because they're fearful their share price will be affected by media reporting. So I actually think we need to use all the levers, and media and spotlighting, which is what Tracey has done, has absolutely brought the government and for companies to the party. And now we've got to say, well, actually, no, we're not trying to tear down one company. We're trying to get all of you to get on board.
Okay.
But you know, can I just say too, the thing that talking about how far we've come in recognizing these things, people need to call out the systems that are underlying here. So again, if you're talking about a case of these big corporations, that's capitalism, right? Nobody wants to use that. It's capitalism at the end of it. It's the same, if we're talking about power and privilege, it's the same power and privilege that allows people to discriminate and be racist can allow them to be sexist and be harassers and abusers. These are systems of oppression and systems that are in place, that have been in place for a long time, that are directly connected to these various forms of oppression and various forms of abuse. And we have to say that out loud. We can't just say this corporation, it's these things, we have to say that.
And Kimberly Crenshaw introduced, I think, one of the most powerful ideas within the feminist movement in the last 30 years around the notion of multiple layers of disadvantage and oppression, which in some respects is more superficially, I think, described as intersectionality. But if you really want to understand the multiple layered oppression and disadvantage by race, by class, by sex, Kyllie, so much of your research, as I've read it, tries to unpack that deep, deep, deep layering of disadvantage and the fact that some people's the axis that they're on is just nowhere near as elevated or privileged as other people in society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's about how do we get people's stories to be heard, and particularly those that are at those intersections. I can remember in some of our research, you know, of examples of women that were Indigenous, that were women, that were hard of hearing, who didn't have hearing, of a young woman who had been sexually assaulted, and she'd gone to the police and the police thought she was drunk. She's trying to communicate with them that she's been sexually assaulted, and they made an assumption based on that she was upset, obviously, and they couldn't work out how to interact. And I think we have to be really careful with sexual assault survivors. I think when someone turns up to a police station, it takes immense courage to turn up to that place and to ask for help.
I might add, I think, without being facetious and being in this town, Tarana, where we've just had the race that stops the nation, that I did hear someone on the radio the other day saying that in relation to the Tanya Day tragedy of the loss of her life,
Yep.
being picked up by railway officers and security people from the train, that on Melbourne Cup Day there would have been thousands and thousands of white women, drunk as skunks, on the trains and not being picked up and not being meeting their fate.
And I think that we actually have to recognise that in this country that our women are particularly vulnerable, that because of race, because of sex, because of the other ways in which our being intersects with poverty, with being traumatised.
So on that, Kyllie, while we've still got you with the mic, there is a question from Natasha Ferro-Bentley, who's here tonight, who filed a question. She's working on a project, Stand and Strong Together. So to you, given that a lot of your research, you have focused on how difficult it can be for Indigenous women to disclose in terms of their family, their kinship networks, the remoteness of their communities. Natasha wants to know, can you see hope? Can you see it possible to find some hope for First Nation peoples in dealing with these really fraught questions of sexual violence, disclosure, support?
Yeah. I mean, I've been working in this space since I was 18, and I do see hope. I see change. I see that we have services that we didn't have when I was 18. We do have people willing to hear. And for the Indigenous community in particular, we've had state-based inquiries right across this nation that have demonstrated that our community is willing and able to address these issues and to hear and discuss these important issues. And I think that gives our young people hope. It doesn't mean that it's not hard to talk about this. It doesn't mean that the first person we talk to mightn't actually hear us or understand our experience. But there are people out there now that are willing and able to.
And what about the generational issue that I know you have focused on?
Yeah, I think the other important thing I think we need to recognise is that, and I've come back to two reports, Little Children Are Sacred from the Northern Territory and a report from New South Wales. And both of those talked about how our young women go to their mums or their grandmas and they tell their mums and their grandmas and they don't listen or they don't act the way that the young people think they should. And that's because mum or grandma or auntie or whoever that they've told has had that experience themselves. And it's about how do we make sure that when we're providing support to our young ones, that we're also providing an open door for those mums, those aunties, those grandmas to actually address their issues too. Because it has to be a community healing. Yeah. It can't be just focused on the individual. It's got to be about how we heal our family. Yeah. That's what's important.
Thank you. Tarana, you referred before to the archetypal person, the Epstein or the Weinstein, and from your writing, you warn of the danger of that, and you've hinted at that tonight, dispelling the notion that if you simply removed him, then it would all be well. So it seems to me that we're becoming very used to the grotesque masculinity that underpins the sort of Trumps and the Epsteins and Johnsons of this world, with their overweening male privilege, unearned, I might add. But we've also seen their ability to close ranks and to use their vast power to protect themselves and go into settlement agreements and hush money and so on, and yet still aspire to office, gain office, as though they're made of Teflon. So, but I want to know the grotesque exceptions like Epstein. What is the danger of that archetype? Is it that it makes others on the spectrum less noticeable in terms of incidents of sexual violence?
Absolutely. I think that we create boogeymen, and we all get to ooh and ah at the Epsteins and all of these names, and they become synonymous with this thing when those people live in our communities. You know, the same way they close ranks in these power structures, they do it in college football teams, they do it in high schools, they do it in churches. You know, it happens in our communities every day, and if we just keep focusing on these individual bad actors, as I call them, or boogeymen, then we will not pay attention. And I also think it's a way for some of us to deflect from that. We know those people exist in our communities, but it's easier to say, oh, look at those bad people over there, and not reflect on what's happening in our families, you know, in our homes. And it is really, it's a problem. It's a really big problem because the conversations have to shift in order for us to really get to the heart of the problem of sexual violence in our communities. Yeah. And to your point, I think a very, very good point about healing intergenerationally. You know, some of this silence has been, a lot of it has been passed down from generation to generation. We've been conditioned almost to only respond to these big stories, or only respond when it becomes larger than life, but to be silent when it's happening right around us. And I talk to young people all the time who, you know, say, I really want to do something about this thing happened to me, but I can't tell my auntie or my mother or whoever because they won't believe me. We do need intergenerational healing. Our first community healing circles, when I started doing work around Me Too, purposefully had elders, older women, and younger women. The older women in the group weren't related to the younger women, but it was important to me that we had representation of older people who could be understanding and who could hear what these girls had gone through. And I think we have to recreate those kind of spaces in our community so we can change the conversation.
I want to talk about backlash, because there's signs of backlash. It had me thinking today, you know, paraphrasing or rejigging that put down about, you know, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. It strikes me that hell hath no fury like patriarchy scorned.
They're so sensitive, right?
and I totally get that there will be a lot of men and powerful men who don't want to relinquish their gendered power. If you're on a good thing, you want to stick with it. But it's power which has actually subjugated women for centuries. But I've also, I'm disquieted by what I see as some dramatic tensions within the broadly defined women's movement as well, which I think, personally, I find it a really unfortunate distraction. And I see that it gets us away from thinking what the main game is here. And the need for sustained hard work. So there's a question from Joanna Fletcher in Thornbury. How do we push back against the pushback? I might get you, Tracey, to start, and we'll work around quickly. How do we push back against the pushback?
Okay, well, let's talk about men first, because I like to call it a commercialised corporate chauvinism. And what I mean by that is the talkback radio hosts that make an awful lot of money out of pushing this incredibly misogynistic line. Now, some of them are genuinely misogynistic. I know a lot of them, and some of them are not, but they know it gets clicks and they know it rates. And I think that is reprehensible. In a way, they are worse than the ones who are genuine misogynists, because they're making a bucket load of cash out of it.
It's the same thing. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go for it.
No, I'm saying it's the same. If you pretend to be or you are, you are.
That's exactly right. Okay. That's exactly right. So I tend to kind of, you know, ignore a lot of those idiots. With regards to some women who are criticising aspects of the movement. I mean, we live in a democracy. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. But I think to move forward that we have to communicate in a very civilised way. And I want to go back to, I understand people's anger. Goodness me, and it's totally justified. But going back to the Sydney Peace Prize, we achieve peace through justice. And we can't kind of criticise violence while being violent ourselves or feeding into that patriarchal narrative of violent language. So all I would say is disagreement is great, but let's just do it in a civilised way.
Kate.
My sense on this conversation is, the research, and Vic Health has done particularly some good research, but there's a range of pieces of research, and the Our Watch framework of Change the Story says it's to be expected when you're making progress. But one of the things I think in Australia is, I think Tarana's visit here is perfectly timed. So we think we had, the sort of 2017, and the reason I think it's perfectly timed is, and we're getting lots of resources, including this live streaming to reuse, is that actually we need to go back and talk about the topic. So the backlash is often about this unfairness for men, particularly, not even false accusations, but where's the natural justice? And it keeps getting off the topic, which is, the topic is the sexual violence, not how poorly done by people who are already in privileged positions are experiencing it. So I actually think that the backlash, I think to Tracey's point, like if I look at the community, I think when I speak, and this might be this room here, about 10 to 20% of the people agree with me and are interested to hear me, and probably 10 to 20 absolutely will never, it doesn't matter. But there's a middle, there's a 60% who actually are genuinely perplexed by this issue, but with someone as wise and experienced as Tarana coming in with a different voice to say what lots of us have been saying for a long time, it's actually an opportunity to bring those 60% people back. So my sense about this moment is, with the idea of the backlash, which no question exists, and it seems to be loud in the media, actually in workplaces and in communities, we've got this moment where people are scared to talk about the topic, or they say terrible things. I'm really interested in our ability to get people to talk about, to move their learning forward. And so rather than the backlash being an argument, when I'm often asked to comment on ridiculous things, I usually say, you don't need to call me, call a man who will, a ridiculous man says this, so call a sensible man who will disagree. You don't need to set it up as the Sex Discrimination Commissioner says this. So it exists, but my focus is improving the conversation and the information. So I know the Sydney Peace Prize knows this. I just think the timing of this visit's really good for us.
Okay, so there's a further question from an Alex Dukic. And Alex asks, which builds on your response, Kate, how do we ensure the movement maintains momentum? I'll start with you, Tarana. In a world of clickbait and 24-hour news, how does the momentum be sustained?
A couple of things. I think, to the point about the backlash in relation to this, I think that it's just like how everything nowadays, people keep saying, oh, that's cancel culture, or that's, people keep couching things that are really relevant in this one way. So there is backlash, and there's a lot of it. There's some that I just completely ignore because I don't have time for nonsense. And then, I'm not fighting with people who are purposefully ornery, right? And then there's some that we have to pay attention to because we don't get it right all the time, right? And so I am an individual person who had a vision, and I have, even the ways in which I've gone about executing this vision have changed and grown over time. And so I recognize that I don't get it right all the time. And so when some backlash comes, I have to pay attention to that, particularly if it's from communities that I say that I want to serve. So if a survivor tells me this thing you did offends me, or this thing that you did you got wrong, I accept that backlash, and I want to try to work through that. Right? I don't want to categorize everything as just vitriol. And I think that part of the way we keep the momentum going is by doing that. We have to acknowledge that this is a big, big, big issue, and that there are so many people who have so many concerns that we can't, as individual people, speak to. I think we have to work in coalition with one another, and I think we have to not try to reinvent the wheel.
Okay, let's come to that later.
Hold on, wait, I want to say one more thing. And so the last part, though, is in order to keep the momentum going in this movement, we have to also put our blinders on to some of the noise out there. We cannot let the media continue to define what Me Too is. There's no way, this has been going, this is 2 years we're at this thing. And so, the first year is like, oh, what does Me Too accomplish in a year? And the second year they're like, what are you up to now? By year 5, it's going to be every 5 years, right? So if we depended on the media to keep the momentum going, we won't have an actual movement. We have to, those of us who show up at places like this, those of us who are interested in this issue, have to know that regardless of how many clicks there are, regardless of how many headlines there are, those numbers haven't changed. Sexual violence is still just as prevalent. So people have to make a commitment to the movement now and not wait for the headlines to keep them going.
Yeah. Tracey's talked about backlash in terms of, commercial, corporate, highly paid guys. You've talked of instance in terms of parts of the women's movement. You've talked about, Tarana, about heeding some backlash, taking notice of it in terms of further insight. Final question from one of our questioners, and I'm actually going to I'll address this, I think, to you and Kyllie, and I'm not actually going to say the person's identity because the nature of, I think, her question, in my view, might make her exposed.
Okay.
So I think it's a young woman from Melbourne South East, and she asks, do you have any advice for women who are afraid to talk because their male family members will give them more grief than their community?
I think that's...
So I'm talking backlash within a family.
Yeah. I think that's a really important question. I think that when we think about backlash, we have to think first and foremost about women's and girls' safety. How do we make sure that they're going to be safe and that they've got a safety net for them when they come forward? I also think that it's a hard one because, as victims of violence, you never quite know what you're going to get when you actually come forward. And you can't counter that the person you're going to go to is going to be a safe person and that they're not going to be the person that's going to give you backlash. So it's about how do we, as a community, provide that safety net for that backlash. And I think, too often in the Indigenous community in particular, because that's what I'm familiar with, that backlash in our community can close down our young people and our women coming forward. It can close down their safety. It can force women and young girls having to leave communities because they're not safe. And we've got, as a community, got to stand up and say, well, how do we hold people accountable for that backlash? How do we make them responsible and accountable for that situation? And that's not just necessarily within our families or communities, it's also holding the media accountable. Because too often, when it's an Aboriginal issue of sexual assault, it's often seen as it's an Aboriginal sexual assault, it's not our business.
Thank you, Kyllie. Tarana, what would you advise about a family member?
Yeah, I get this question often. The thing I tell people, anybody that's going to disclose, is that disclosure is not easy. And yes, people put the hashtag out on social media, but one of the things that concerned me when I saw that was that that there's no safety in that, right? That people were just sort of cutting and bleeding all over the internet and there was no container to process. And so for anybody that wants to disclose, I think you have to think very hard and deep about how you do it. And you have to have a plan. I think that, to your point, sometimes people disclose and the first person they tell is the worst person you could possibly tell. So it takes some introspection about thinking about who your team is, who your tribe is. And in a family situation, if you tell it publicly and you think you're going to put yourself in danger, and I mean the kind of danger that backlash does to you emotionally, then that might not be the place to tell. I think having a plan of finding somebody outside of your family and outside of that structure is really important. And a lot of us have to do that. A lot of us, particularly in communities of color, you have to go outside of your family structure to find that, because the culture of silence, I have, in my own world and in the world of sort of talking to survivors, numbers of times where I've had people come and say, I told my mother and she told me don't say anything. Or I told my, this is the thing. And it's like the inclination, particularly again in communities of color, is to protect our men because they have so many other daggers coming at them from outside of the community. And so we are forced to put aside our own pain and our own trauma in order to support this family structure. And so there's lots to talk about that, but putting that aside in terms of the immediacy of this, what this this person is talking about, I say do a little bit of research and find out where support exists. And if it feels like it's going to be adverse to your life and your existence in that household or in your community, do not disclose in that community. It's just not going to be worth it, and it's in general. I want to say to people who are struggling about disclosure, there's something about this moment, and this moment in history, I think, not just with Me Too, but pop culture, that makes people feel like if their story isn't told loudly and publicly, that it's not valid. And it has to be validated on the internet or validated in, I've gone to colleges where students are doing like poetry slam kind of events where it's just one person after another coming up telling the gory details of what happened. I don't encourage that. Disclosure is important, but disclosure is important because we need to get it out of our bodies. For those of us who have survived sexual violence, it is important to get that trauma out of your body, out of your mouth. There's something cathartic about saying it to yourself. The very first person you have to tell your story to is yourself. Because when it happens, we put it away, we put it in a box, we put it on a shelf, and we don't want to think about it or talk about it anymore. And so when the truth feels like it's bubbling up and has to come out, talk to yourself in the mirror. If you're able to tell yourself your own story, that is the first step of starting a disclosure process. But you don't have to ever say Me Too. You don't have to use the hashtag. You don't have to tell your story. You don't have to say it out loud. You could whisper it in the wind. You could write it in a poem. You can put it in a journal. You can tell it in a pillow. You can tell your best friend. You just need to get it out. Don't feel like this moment calls for validation and you have to write a news story about it or put it on Instagram, whatever the social media thing is. Because you can't guarantee your safety in that way. So that's just a message in general about disclosure that I think is important for people to hear, because they think, I want to be a part of the Me Too movement. We are here, we exist, we are talking, we are representing this so that you don't have to.
And I think you talk about as a movement, and your point about disclosure being important for healing. But from what I've read of your work too, Tarana, the importance of disclosure is also for accountability down the track and also for action in communities.
But individual disclosure is not necessary for action. And I want to also make that distinction. It's important that people understand the magnitude of the problem, but I think more so here's the thing that I see all the time, and I'm sure you'll see this. You see people testifying about the violence that they've experienced. You see people disclosing, in the U.S. when we had the Kavanaugh hearings, there were the two women who ran up on the senator and they started talking about their stories, and it was heart-wrenching. But how many details do you need to understand that this problem is so prevalent? How much do you need to hear about who touched me and how they touched me and all of those to know that we have to do something about sexual violence? What we need to disclose is what it costs. What we need to disclose is what happens in our lives. And the reason why you have so many people who have experienced sexual violence whose lives fall apart and what that means to how we function in society, that should be enough for people to move to action. I shouldn't have to say, Daddy touched me at 6 years old in order for you to feel empathy for me to pass a law.
Yep. I think that's one of the great strengths of since 2006 with Me Too, in that so many thousands of women around the globe have felt a sense of connection enough for it to build. So the question of Me Too as a movement, we've seen this vast scaling up of something that is deeply personal. We can't expect movements of this sort to necessarily be coherent, to have clearly articulated goals that are all shared. It doesn't necessarily have enough resources, and there are setbacks. Denise Chapman filed a question in, which I think is really important for tonight, and your notion, Tarana, of getting on with a lot of it now. Denise's question from Cranbourne is, what is the one thing we can do each day and each week to support the Me Too movement?
Am I answering that one first?
Yep, you can start.
Well, I do want to say that, contrary to your point, we do have stated goals, and we have a framework that we've put forward so people understand what it means to work under Me Too, and say that you're doing the work of the Me Too movement. Part of what we couldn't control when it went viral is the fact that everybody could lay claim to it, and so people across the world are like, "Oh, I'm doing Me Too movement." And so, if you are working against sexual violence in a way that pulls people from the margins to the center, that acknowledges the violence that happens, the breadth of violence that happens across the spectrum of sexual violence, there are certain parameters that we've set forward that says this is what it means to work in the Me Too movement. We are working towards ending sexual violence, and to the point of this person, you can't get to ending sexual violence unless you are consistently interrupting sexual violence. And that's what we have to do on a day-to-day basis. What that looks like is what we call actions and micro actions. So bigger actions are there. Those of us on the front line who are working to dismantle systems, who are working to do mass public education and awareness and those kind of empowering survivors. There are very clear things that are happening on a day-to-day basis. You're sitting at home and you're like, I'm so inspired by this, I want to know what to do. The thing that I tell people all the time is to think about what your day-to-day life is. Think about, particularly if you're a survivor or if you know one, there are so many gaps around us. There are so many ways that things fall through the cracks. Again, I was one person living in a community that saw a deficit. There were no resources for little black girls who looked like me, who had experienced the things that I experienced. There was nobody speaking healing into the lives of those young people or into our lives as adults. So if you want to be active, think about, you can do a simple thing like go to work. Is today Monday? Tomorrow. Australia has me so upside down. One day during the work week. But people don't read the sexual harassment policies at their jobs. Go read it. Read it and think about what your life is like in that office, in that position, in that place. And does that policy cover what you deal with in that place? Talk to your children, talk to your schools about the people who work around our children and how they're vetted. You know, ask questions, be curious. You can do a simple thing as don't read an article about Me Too in the newspaper and believe that is fact without doing your own research. You know, we have to shift our behaviors. If you don't have the time to volunteer, if you don't want to be on the front lines, if you don't have the money to donate, shift your behavior. Think about, and this is for everybody, not just men. We have to stop telling men that they just have to change so we can end this situation. A lot of us carry and have been raised with sexist and misogynistic ideas. Think about the ways that you interact in life that contribute to rape culture, because rape culture is what creates the space for violence to happen. So these little shifts, these micro actions, all lend themselves to advancing this movement. Talk about Me Too differently. Is Thanksgiving? Y'all have Thanksgiving? No, you wouldn't have Thanksgiving because that's just us that think we discovered.
Not yet, anyhow.
So whatever Christmas is coming, right? Just trying to think of a family holiday. I love that Christmas is in summertime here, by the way. It is freaking me out, but I love it. But Christmas is coming, and when you are at home and you have the grumpy uncle or the crotchety aunt who's like, oh, this Me Too has gone too far. There are these women, it's a gender, whatever they're saying. Be the voice that says, no, that's not what's happening. I know the truth about this movement. you just give it some thought and some intention, and you can think about ways to contribute, and don't think that there's any contribution that's too small, because there's not.
Yep, okay. I'm going to ask... And I should qualify that I wasn't actually saying there are no clear goals. I was actually quoting some critics of Me Too and disagreeing with them as I read about them. But we've got a little bit more time. I want to talk about the systems change, addressing the more systemic basis to this, with a sort of vision by 2030. One of the drivers, I think, of the Me Too movement is of the possibility of a better world, a possibility of shaping the world, of not, in feminist terms, wanting a society where women are equal to men in terms of how they behave and what they aspire to, but actually a better world, fashioned from the strengths of the existing world and fashioned in response to the awful things that happen in our world. So, assuming that all the panellists are fired by a better world for all, Lisa Carson in Canberra fired in a question: what does a world without male violence against women look like? I mean, I know it might seem a really obvious question. If we want to stop the violence, want to stop the sexual violence, what kind of world do you think that takes us to in terms of qualities, power relations, reciprocity, respect, and so on? Tracey, let's start. Let's work quickly around the panel.
I would briefly suggest that we need less hierarchical power structures in all of society's institutions. And I'm talking about from business to the community sector to the household, because when we have more flat feminist structures, there are fewer great power imbalances, and that's what contributes towards the sexual harassment and indecent assault.
And I'd just like to compliment you, Tarana, because you got asked a question about what's the one thing, and I think if anyone knows, I always say there's not one thing, but you gave about 30 things that people could do. So I'm going to learn to do that in future. What's really come out consistently in our work, and if you look at the things in Australia, women's economic security, women in leadership and violence, underpinning it all, we're striving for gender equality in this country. We've had it in education, at least primary and secondary, we've got it there. So that's what it would look like. But if I take it up a notch and think about all the conversations at the moment, the Banking Royal Commission, the Royal Commission into Child Sex Abuse, our sexual harassment inquiry, underpinning it every time when I talk to particularly young people, but anyone, saying what is a workplace that where you're safe from sexual harassment, what does that look like? And where you've had it, what was there? They always say it's environments of respect, integrity and trust. And so that, in my sense, it's a world where your role and your merit isn't defined by your gender, and that there is respect, integrity and trust no matter who you are and no matter where you sit.
Kyllie?
I tend to agree. I think that we need a society that respects all people, not based just on our gender, but also based on where we sit with our race, where we sit with our disabilities. If it takes away the intersectionality and respects all people, then we might have a chance of looking at this. But I also think it's about hearing, being willing to hear, and to being able to and this might sound crass, but to love each other. When we sit with our kids, we love our kids. We want them to grow up in a world that's safe. If we offered that kind of respect to all individuals, then we'd be in a better place.
Tarana, I read something where you said we have to come together and speak honestly about what the barriers are and then tear them down. And you say it's really that simple. I love that. You said that. But I'm thinking over all the sort of major interventions that we have in front of us: restorative justice, procedural justice, defamation laws, workplaces, family supports, parenting supports, you name it. We have to surely think of the whole suite of bold interventions. to achieve that vision, yeah?
Yeah. I use this analogy, sorry if you've heard it already, but about how not very long ago we all smoked on airplanes and in our workplaces, and cigarette smoking was just accepted as normal. And it's obviously not the same as sexual violence, but the reason why I think about it is because the level of intervention that it took, multiple interventions that it took to get us to a place where young people like my daughter think that tobacco smoke and cigarette smoke is disgusting, and it's immediately equated with dying and lung cancer, but 20, 25 years ago, we had the Marlboro Man and the Virginia Slims lady, and we had people smoking in movies and on television, right? But there was a judicial intervention, right? There were these huge lawsuits that were levied against the tobacco companies. Yeah. There was a medical and research intervention because you had all these studies that came forward that said secondhand smoke will kill you, and so don't smoke in the car with your kid, right? With the windows rolled up. You had a community intervention. You had people on a grassroots level saying we want these tobacco machines, these cigarette machines taken out of places where young people can access them, or out of schools or out of job sites, whatever. So you had cultural intervention. That's why we stopped seeing it in our media and things like that. It took all of those things working together at the same time, and clearly people still smoke. But the thought, the way we think about smoking, the way we have relegated it to sort of those people go in the room and smoke-filled room by themselves now, is, and you have, again, they're trying to make vaping cool, but young kids are like, this is nasty. I don't want to die of lung cancer. You think of that immediately. When I think about how we change the world, I think about comprehensive sex education. Yep. And what it would look like to start teaching young people. If you can teach a 4 or 5-year-old to not run with scissors and say please and thank you, you can teach them about consent. You can teach them about dignity, right? It's not that hard. Okay. People try to make it more complicated than it is, but if it becomes a normal way that we socialize children, by the time they come through grade school, you have a generation of young people who look at this differently, who think about it differently.
Okay, I want to draw it to a slightly slow close, because it's, and I want to do fairness to some of the questioners. We had a question from Louise Sampson, and I think we've addressed this in part, but I'm just going to get a very quick response from each of you. Louise says, it's often said that the biggest risk for activists is succumbing to cynicism, that the problems are so big that nothing we do can really change things systematically. How do you inoculate against cynicism and pessimism? Tracey, in a quick word, how do you inoculate yourself against being cynical and pessimistic?
You've got to look at the long game instead of the short game. As the great Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Okay, thank you. Kate?
I think there was a premise in that no matter what you do, you're not going to change the system. That I'd pick on. Look at Tarana, who in 2006 wouldn't have imagined she'd be here, amazed that Melbourne has a summer, Christmas. So I actually think that no matter, and it might go to Tracey's comment as well, that no matter what, actually your actions are making a difference because collectively we do. So that would be my kind of encouragement is self-care, so you don't have to be in the fight the whole time, but your contribution is important.
Kyllie?
I agree with both those comments. It is a long game, and it is that all of us can make a difference if we put our words into action. So we actually need to hear and we need to put our words into action.
I actually think a little bit of cynicism is not bad. I think we have to be realistic that this is hard and it is thankless sometimes. And I have put this thing down and picked it back up several times because of it. I think that when you feel burned out, you should stop. I'll just say this really quickly. I had the beautiful gift of interviewing, or talking to rather, Toni Morrison, the author Toni Morrison, who was just one of my favorite people in the world. It's actually my daughter who asked the question about what do you do when you feel burned out and you have writer's block, and she said, I don't believe in writer's block. I believe when you write when you have something to say, and when you don't, it's just a pause, and you should respect the pause. And I take that as gospel for my life. If you are in this work, it is hard, and you feel like you need to pause, and you feel cynical, that is indication that you might need to take a step back. You're going to come back, because we can't stay away. This is the crazy part, right? We can't stay away. You will come back, but it's better to take a moment to heal yourself, to feel whole, to get to be recharged in the way that you need, and come back into this work fully ready to do it, than to push yourself past limits and be cynical and the kind of person nobody wants to be around and really half-ass do the work, than to just respect the pause.
And the last question from the audience, and this is not last but not least, or some deference on my part to it being a male questioner, but we do have a question from Ross Eggleton. He asks, can men be feminists, and what are the best ways to change men's behaviour? Quickly, Tracey.
Look, I believe that men can be feminists, although my husband calls himself an equalist rather than a feminist. And my husband was one of those blokes who it took a bit of time for him to come around, and that's because of storytelling, which is exactly about what the Me Too movement is all about. The fact that he knew people who'd had these experiences and the scales fell from his eyes. So I also think that that we need a bit of reframing of men's situation in this, because men can be survivors as well. They can be strong bystanders or upstanders, and they can be powerful allies instead of predominantly men. We know that the vast number of perpetrators are men, but if they're only framed as that, men are not going to open their ears to this conversation.
Thank you. Kate?
And I guess I do quite a lot of work with the Australian Defence Forces, and that's really helped me explain. So what I would ask men, but also women, to do is improve their gender expertise. So that doesn't mean you have to be the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, but actually when things happen, people will say, no, that can't be right, and I know all of the reasons why they've misunderstood. So in Defence, what they do is they talk about they have gender expertise. They have people who are the gender focal points, and those are people, and they're men and women. So in my general life, I think there's a lot of women as well as men who don't have just a 101 on, they're very much, we've got equality, what's the problem? That actually it's not that hard to understand. I can do a 1 hour, kind of chat to a room of people, and I often do this. You've all come in, you all think it's all gone too far, you're sick of reading about women's sport, as we know, and you think that's because there's equality. Actually, let's go back and look at the bottom. Here's the data, here's what's going on. So my main request for men, but also for many women who don't work in this, is just to understand that the impact of gender inequality, of capitalism, of, this idea that, we should have more women in senior roles because you can make more money that way.
Okay.
So that would be my ask.
And Kyllie?
I think in all of the reports that have ever been written on Indigenous family violence and sexual abuse, our women and our men have been clear that to respond to violence in our communities requires men and women to be at the party, that we need to work together. We are the solution together. And I think without men beside us, we won't get the resolution we need.
Thank you.
Obviously men can be feminists. There's so many men who proclaim themselves as feminists and do this work really, really well alongside of us as co-conspirators, as allies, if you will. I think we've been speaking in very gendered language tonight, but absolutely the thing that I always say is that the Me Too movement is not a woman's movement. And we need to acknowledge that the men's first role in this movement is as survivors. And engagement, I also think it's not helpful to only ever engage men about what they do wrong and how they have to change, but without being reflective of the ways that we all have to change. And so there is lots of space for men to not be scared, to come into this work, and to really, if you really, really are interested in the work of ending sexual violence, which you should be, because it's a human rights issue, right? It's an issue about the undermining of our humanity at the end of the day. And so as a human being, you should be interested in this. If you're really interested in it, you can push through the muck and push through the gender wars and all the things that the media categorizes as, and really listen to what's being said about what the movement is. There's plenty of space for men. Yeah. There's plenty of space for you to come in, not be defensive, but it does mean that the men who come into this space, who want to do better and be better, have to be prepared to hear some things that are going to make them uncomfortable. Don't be afraid of discomfort. We cannot make change without discomfort. We cannot move the needle without, we all have to get really, really uncomfortable, and uncomfortable with the statistics, with the stories, with the reality. It's okay. You'll be comfortable again at some point, or maybe you won't. Okay. You know?
Okay. So I'm going to give the last word to Tarana in some writing of hers. She said, no, I mean, I thought this was amazing. I am one person who saw a problem and tried my best to ignore it. I tried to ignore it when it happened to me. I tried to ignore it when it happened to folks in my family, and I tried to ignore it when I saw it ripping my community apart. I tried and tried until the part of my heart that has a passion for justice could not ignore it any longer. Today, none of us can justify ignoring it. Thank you, Tarana.
Thank you.
And before I call on Alana Johnson to say a word of thanks, and before you get the chance to hear that beautiful voice of Jess Ribeiro again, could I ask you to please thank our wonderful panellists joining Tarana: Tracey Spicer, Kate Jenkins, Kyllie Cripps. Alana.
And thank you. Thank you for being such a great moderator. Psych, I wasn't going
to... that hour just flew, didn't it? And it'd be lovely to sit here for another hour. I just feel like I wanted to soak so much more in. So I suppose one thing we can do before we leave is just take a quiet moment and think, what are you going to take home with you from this? It was so rich and there was so much. For me, I know that Tarana's statement, make a commitment to the movement now, don't rely on the media for momentum, is a powerful statement for me. The notion of changing the narrative, of actually starting to talk about systems of oppression, about gender equality, and having the conversations with people. I think Mary made that very powerful statement at the start. If in the feminist movement we do nothing but talking, then things won't change. We need to take action now beyond talking. And Tarana spoke to us about the need to shift our behaviour and for all of us to make some commitment to doing something differently. So for me, I know I'm going to take those things home and seriously think about those and talk about those with people in my life. So thank you, all of you, for what you've contributed to us and how that will make a difference to our lives. So let me thank our partners for this evening, the Sydney Peace Foundation and Susan. Without you, we wouldn't have had tonight, so thank you very much. and to be here in the wonderful Collingwood Town Hall. It has so many stories of its own. I want to thank the venue staff who have been so wonderful in setting the event up, the security staff, the photographers, and for those of you like me who want to see this again, we need to thank Emma White Travel, who have made the live streaming possible tonight, but also that you'll be able to view this for the next 12 months. So spread the word and get as many people looking at that streaming as you can. Of course, events like this are synonymous with the Victorian Women's Trust. I always get blown away by the incredible work the staff and the volunteers do as a team, and it really is a team effort. And without other states are jealous, and no wonder why. We have this amazing Victorian Women's Trust, and we do things like this that really make a difference in our state. So, in plugging the Victorian Women's Trust, don't forget to buy some merchandise in the lobby, to actually have a sample and think about subscribing to our podcast on money, power and freedom, and to think in your own way how you can support the Women's Trust and how you can spread the good word about the Women's Trust and what we're doing. So as the panel now step off the stage, I'm going to reintroduce Jess Ribeiro, who's going to come back and appropriately close the evening for us. So as Jess comes on, and everybody is flooding out, I think the other person that we need to give a great round of applause to is the Executive Director of the Victorian Women's Trust, Mary Crooks. Mary's preparation for every time she does an event like this amazes me, and we get this incredible richness and depth because of the work that Mary puts in, and I think we're so lucky to have her there sitting on the stage so many times doing events like this for us. So thank you, Mary. And so we welcome back Jess Ribeiro. So Jess is an award-winning singer and songwriter, and that beautiful opening that we had, I was reading about Jeff and it said her narrative poetic songs are said to travel across the desert like a westerner. Well, actually, I think they actually travel across us like this beautiful breeze. I just loved it washing over us. So thank you, and please welcome Jess Ribeiro.
When you're down and low and your heart feels cold and you fear you can't go on, there's a flicker of light in the dark of the night if you just take hold of hope. It'll come to pass, it'll come to pass, it'll come to pass. Oh, time won't wait for nothing. It'll come to pass. There's a star in the sky that sings your name to the entire universe. It rose like a flower on the very first hour of your heavenly human birth. It'll come to pass. It'll come to pass. It'll come to pass. Oh, time won't wait for nothing. It'll come to pass. So when you're feeling pain, don't be ashamed or hide amidst your sorrows. Help us here, my darling dear, have faith in tomorrow. It'll come to pass. It'll come to pass, it'll come to pass. Oh, time won't wait for nothing. It'll come to pass. All of this, the mess we're in, remember it will pass. Though it's grim, don't give in, believe in tomorrow. It'll come to pass, it'll come to pass, it'll come to pass. Oh, time won't wait for nothing. It'll come to pass, it'll come to pass, it'll come to pass, it'll come to pass. Oh, time won't wait for nothing. It'll come to pass.